if you were to call me and say, I'm at Come and Go, I need to know how to get to the church. It's easy, all right? I want you to turn right out of the parking lot onto the 5-lane road. I want you to go through the big curve. And once you get through the big curve, I want you to take the third left, and then we'll be on the right. Super easy instructions. Easy to get here. So you call me and you say, I want to know how to get to the church. I give you the instructions, and you leave Come and Go. You pull out on the 5-lane road. You turn right. You go through the big curve. It doesn't really seem like a curve, though. You go through this curve, and it's kind of a curve, but you end up in somewhere. And then once you kind of get to a straight stretch, you take the third right, and suddenly you're at First Baptist Rogers, which is not a bad place to be, but not where we were trying to get you to be. See, the problem is if I give you excellent instructions, but you start at a totally different place than I'm giving you instructions from, you're not going to end up at the right spot. See, I think that you're at Come and Go right over here by the church. But you think that you are at the Come and Go right over by my house. Either of those instructions, those are two starting places. You both start the Come and Go. You're going to turn right. You're going to follow those instructions exactly. You're going to do everything sincerely. You're going to do it as accurately as possible. But if you start in the wrong place, it doesn't matter how well you follow my instructions or how great my instructions are. If you start at the wrong spot, you're going to end up at the wrong spot. It's pretty basic. Nobody didn't really need that explained. But it's a thing that we need to think about, because when we're looking at the book of Colossians, which is what we're doing right now, the church at Colossae was struggling. And they were struggling because they didn't know what to do. They were sincere believers who wanted to believe the truth, who wanted to be at the right spot, but they weren't sure what to do. They had the Old Testament, and they were trying to apply that. They had new ideas that people were thought about and were trying to come up with ideas. They had never had an apostle there. They were started by the disciple of an apostle who had come and heard the apostle preach, heard the apostle Paul preach, and then went back to Colossae and started the church there. But they just didn't know what to do. And so they're dealing with 4 big heresies there, and they don't know what to do. So they send Epaphras, their pastor, to Paul while he's in prison in Rome. They send him to him and say, we need help. We don't know what to do. And Paul, instead of attacking all those specific heresies and saying, this is why this heresy is wrong, and this is why this heresy is right, and you should believe this particular thing, what he says is, like, you've got the instructions. You're just starting at the wrong spot. So instead of attacking all the turns that you're making that are wrong, what I'm going to do is I'm going to help you get back to the right starting spot. And if you can start at the right starting spot, then everything else is going to line up. And so the starting place for them that he wants them to get to is who Jesus is and what he did. And he said, if you will get who he is and what he did, then the rest of this stuff is going to fall into place. Because you don't understand who he is and what he did, you're all ended up in crazy places that we don't intend you to be. But I want you to come back to the starting place and then start over, and you'll get to where you need to be. So last week we looked at the prayer that he prayed for them. And this church is so close to us, at least as close to us as any other church in the New Testament, because they didn't have an apostle there with them. They didn't have somebody to speak authoritatively and say, my words are God's words. But instead, they were trying to apply Scripture and their own knowledge to come up with the truth. We're very similar in that. So we looked at this prayer that Paul prayed for them and said, if this is what he would pray for them, who are so close to us, this is what he would pray for us, and we prayed that for ourselves. This week, we want to jump right into this starting point, because if for them starting in the right place would land them in the right place, then for us, if we will start in the right place, we'll land in the right place. So we want to talk about that. So let's just read through this prayer again, because we didn't finish the prayer last week, because the last sentence of the prayer is the first sentence of what he wants to explain to them about the starting spot. So let's jump right in there and talk about that. Colossians chapter 1, verse 9. Says, and so from the day we heard, we have not ceased to pray for you, asking that you may be filled with a knowledge of his will and all spiritual wisdom and understanding, so as to walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to him, bearing fruit in every good work, and increasing in the knowledge of God, being strengthened with all power according to his glorious might, for all endurance and patience with joy, giving thanks to the Father who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. That's the prayer. And if you want to know more about that prayer and what we prayed about last week, you have to go back and watch last week, because if I'm not careful, I'll just re-preach the same thing from last week. But we want to jump in, and where we want to jump in really is in verse 12, because verses 12, 13, and 14 really tell us about the work of Jesus, and that's where we're going to camp out today. Before we jump into that, I want to tell you about the 4 different heresies that they were facing and how Paul's going to deal with each one of those in this. So the first heresy that they were facing is called Gnosticism. Starts with a G. It's a silent G. They're just to frustrate us and make our lives difficult. Gnosticism means knowledge. That's what this word means. And the Gnostics believed some weird stuff that they got really from Greek philosophy and carried it over and applied it to Christianity. The Gnostics believed, first of all, that all physical things are evil. All physical things are evil. That means your body is evil, the earth is evil, everything there is evil. And if it's evil, then God, who is perfect and not evil, must not have created it. Rather, God must have created something else that created all this stuff. So they start talking about these little godlings that God creates, and he creates these little like semi-gods, demigods, and they get farther and farther from him until the last one gets so far from him that it's evil and it creates the whole world. And that means that when Jesus came back, because physical things are evil, Jesus must not have been a real person. He must not have been a physical body. He was like a ghost. And he looked real, but he wasn't real. And if he wasn't real, he wasn't physically real, then he didn't actually die, but rather he just seemed to have died because he wasn't real in the first place. And so there's that whole thing. And their belief was that the way that you are saved, the way that you enter into a relationship with God, the way that you're made right with God, is by receiving special knowledge. And once you understand their nonsense, that means that you have the special knowledge, and you're one of them, and you're saved. They referred to this as being lightened or darkened, that if you'd received the light, then you were special. You were one of God's chosen ones. And if you understood all this stuff and could connect all the dots the way they do, then you got it. And anybody that disagreed with them clearly was in the darkness and didn't get it. So they fought a lot, and the apostles deal with Gnosticism quite a bit because there's all these things that really undermined everything that we believe about Jesus in Gnosticism. The second thing that they dealt with is paganism. And you can understand why they would stick with some paganism, because paganism is just the worship of multiple gods. It's really all it is. It's that you worship a bunch of different gods. And so what they did is they come from this system where you've got Zeus and you got Hera and you've got all these other guys, but then you have these lesser beings, you have all these spiritual beings, and you have all these people that, as far as you're concerned, are real and are active and working in the world. And so what they did is they brought Jesus in and said, all this stuff is true still, but Jesus is over them all. But they still have power and they're still working. And you got to make sure that you appease these other beings. Otherwise, they're going to cause you a lot of problems. So Jesus is God. Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus is real, but so is everything else. And if you're not careful, you're going to run into trouble. And what they did is they swapped out all these other beings that they had in Greek and Roman mythology for angels. And so they would apply some of our beliefs about Satan and the fall of the angels, and they would stick them on top of their paganism, but then they would try to take care, appease those pagan images. And so you got all kinds of craziness that they're concerned about. And they're trying to take care of worshiping angels, which Paul refers to several times here. They're worshiping them in order to keep them from causing them problems while still recognizing that Jesus is the Son of God. So it was super mixed up. Then we get into asceticism. And a lot of people deal with asceticism today. Asceticism, these are these other words with extra unnecessary letters that confuse us here. Asceticism is the denial of pleasure as worship, or pain to cleanse from sin. Right? You see these movies about medieval monks or whatever, that they would beat themselves with scourges. That's asceticism. That is punishing yourself to get rid of that. Denying any pleasure, because again, this goes back to Gnosticism. All physical things must be evil, so that means enjoying physical things must be evil. That means to worship God, you've got to stay away from any kind of pleasure. And so they would deny anything. Some of what Brother David read about these arguments about meat and drink and all these things, come back to this idea of asceticism, that you've got to refrain from all things pleasurable, otherwise you're not worshiping God. And then you get just the run-of-the-mill, which seems, after all that, seems pretty basic, just the Jewish legalism. That is that, yes, you're saved through faith, but you are you become a Jew at that point, and you've got to keep all the Old Testament law. So yes, you are saved by faith, but you maintain that salvation by following all the rules. You can understand why the Colossians were so mixed up and why they sent Epaphras to go to Rome and say, hey, we need help because we don't know what we're doing. We are lost. And Paul is not going to attack really any of these head on. He's not going to break these apart, but he's going to take digs at them all the way through. And so I'm telling you about this because just in these first few verses, he takes digs at all these things that they're struggling with. And if you look at these things, we struggle with a lot of these things too. Hopefully there's not a whole lot of paganism in your world. I hope there's not too much paganism in your world, really any at all. But we still deal with that, right? How many people have told you need to bury a Joseph statue in your front yard to sell your house? When I worked at Mardell, we sold Joseph statues all the time because you got to bury one in your front yard to help sell your house. That you get all these kinds of ideas that you've got these competing things alongside Christianity. The Gnosticism, the idea that, well, only the special people who really get our specific brand of heresy are the special ones and are the saved ones. Anybody who doesn't get this, if you got it, you would get it, but you don't get it, so you don't get it. You know what I mean? We've got that kind of thing. And then we get people that are like, we've got to deny all pleasure. That is still all wrapped up in this, that any pleasure, not just sinful pleasure, but any pleasure is bad. As Baptists, we're pretty ascetic. Like somebody starts having a good time, we get real concerned. Like surely they're doing something wrong or they wouldn't be having that good of a time. We get real concerned about that kind of thing. And then the legalism that they put on that. We're not following the Jewish legalism. We're not requiring that people offer sacrifices and those things. But we're pretty strict about stuff. And we add these rules on top of people. And it's not to maintain your salvation, but if you were saved, you're probably doing it anyway, right? We struggle with all of these things. And so I just want to jump into what Paul had to say about this because it's so relevant to what we're dealing with. So let's go back to verse 12. And we're going to look at 12 through 14 the whole time today. So 12 through 14. Giving thanks to the Father who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. He has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of His beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. So the first thing that Paul does is he deals with this whole idea of all these other spiritual beings that are going to cause us problems. And how he deals with that is by talking about who has done the work of making us right with Him. He points out the Father and the Son. The Father and the Son are the only two involved in what's going on. So we talk about fallen angels, we talk about Satan, we talk about all those things that are real and that we'll deal with at another time. But Paul said, for the sake of your relationship with God, you being made right with God, it doesn't matter if those things exist or not. What matters to you is the Father and the Son. Because regardless of whatever else exists, they have authority and they have done this work. The Father, what the Father and the Son have done is they have qualified you to share in the inheritance of the saints of light. Go ahead and skip on to the next slide, Cooper, there. I just want to point out these two words, that what the Father and Son did. They qualified you to share in the inheritance of the saints. Now, we got to talk about this word saint. We talked about this a little bit last week. We've got a lot of baggage put on the word saint. Okay? In Catholicism, a saint is basically just somebody who was so super good that they attained superhero status. And they can do miracles, and they can do miracles after their death. You've got this saint. And there's a lot more to it. And if you want like the thorough explanation of saints, Destin will be available after services. And he can tell you all of that way better than I can. But a saint in the New Testament, a saint biblically is not someone who's so super special that they can do extra special things. They're not a Christian superhero. A saint, as far as the New Testament is concerned, is someone who is trusted in Jesus to save them. Someone who has recognized that I'm a sinner, that I'm bound for hell because of my sin, and what Jesus has done for me is Jesus, the Son of God, died on my behalf so that if I would trust in Him to take care of my sins for me, He would do that. What happens is that our status is changed. The word saint comes from sanctified, that's set apart. And those that have trusted in Jesus for their salvation are set apart. They're sanctified. And they become saints. So when he says saints, I don't want you to think like statue and miracles. I want you to think sinner who is so bad that they've recognized that only Jesus can save them. That's what he's talking about. So what the Father has done is qualified us to share in the inheritance of the saints of light. And what's important to notice is who did the work. Who is the one that did the qualifying? It's the Father. They're concerned. They're really concerned that if I don't do enough good, that I'm not going to be good enough. That if I don't do enough good, if I don't keep the rules enough, then I'm going to lose what I've earned or what's been given to me. But what he says is the work that you're concerned about is not even your work, but it's his work. What the Father has done is he has qualified you to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. We look at that word darkness and light that shows up. He's digging at Gnosticism. He's dealing with We're dealing with the Jewish legalism that says you've got to keep these rules. We're dealing with asceticism that you've got to endure enough pain and scourge that out. We're dealing with Gnosticism and the idea that God's not even involved in this whole situation and that if we're good enough that he might give us some light. But he says, no, look, what the Son came to do, his whole work, was to make it possible for you to be qualified because the supreme being of the universe wanted you qualified. He wanted you qualified. And it's like you weren't even a part of this conversation. We're taking the kids on vacation. And we care about what they want to do. We do. But they're not making decisions about this. We're making the decisions. We're paying for it. We're transporting them from here to where we need to be. We're providing for them during the entire vacation and giving them things to do. And if it were up to them to go on vacation, they could not make it. It is the work of Brittany and I that will get them on the vacation, that will take care of them during the vacation, and that will bring them home. It is our work. And it doesn't really matter what they do. They're going to do things that displease me. They're going to do things that please me. But it doesn't really matter because it is my pleasure, it is our pleasure to take them on this trip. And what Paul says when he outlines this is like, you're concerned about your actions. Here's what I want you to know. Your actions are not a part of the consideration. The actions of the Father and the Son are what matter. The desire of the Father is that you would be qualified. The work of the Son is to qualify you so that any who have faith will be qualified. And if you're concerned that you're not good enough or you're not doing enough to take care of this, it's like my kids being concerned that they don't have enough money to go on vacation. You don't. And it doesn't really matter because it's not up to you. The Father and the Son have qualified you who believe to share with the inheritance of the saints of light. You think about an inheritance. What is an inheritance? It's a thing that you receive from someone else. When your parent or your grandparents die, they give you what they have. And it's not up to you to earn that inheritance. It's not up, in a healthy family, it's not up to you to make that inheritance. They take what is theirs and give it to you. Nowhere in this conversation that Paul has, that's the 3 verses we're looking at. Nowhere in this conversation that Paul has does he say, if you are good enough, if you try hard enough, if you punish yourself enough, if you appease the angels don't even matter. Satan does not matter in this conversation. None of that matters. What matters is the Father and the Son hatched a plan to qualify us who would believe. And the work is up to them to do. This is why this matters so much. This is why this matters so much. Every religion is a system of trying to make God happy. Every religion. You can swap out the names of the different gods. Every religion is about trying to make a God happy. Maybe the God you're trying to make happy is our God. Maybe the God you're trying to make happy is Allah. Maybe the God you're trying to make happy is the universe. It doesn't matter. It's trying to do enough or to do the right things to appease them so that they will be okay with you. That's what all of it is. And what makes Christianity different is unlike some other religion that says if you will keep the 5 pillars, then you're made right with God. Or if you do enough good in the world and you're neutral enough, then you can make God happy in the God's universe and you become one with God. The difference with Christianity is the first tenet of Christianity is you can't be good enough to make God happy. You can't do enough to satisfy God. The thing about our religion is how ineffective it is. Because every other religion says, follow this 5-step plan and you will make God happy. And our religion says, you want to make God happy? Too bad. That's not possible. The work of Jesus is to make God happy on our behalf. Is to do the work on our behalf. And this is the thing that identifies what is Christianity and what is not. Because when you have to say, yes, the work of Jesus is what has appeased God, the work of Jesus is what has made you right with God, but also make sure you do all these other things, that's not the work of Jesus. That's the work of Jesus and you, which really depends on you. And this is why that makes a difference. You look at every other religion and we say, well, these are all pretty much the same. You're all supposed to love your neighbor. You're all supposed to be nice and give to charity and do those things. And on that scale, sure, they're all pretty similar. But the root of those things is different because the root of the gospel is that you can't make God happy. You have to have Jesus make him happy for you. And the root of every other religion is if you keep these rules, then you will appease God. And what Paul says is you're starting in the wrong spot because you're saying, how do I appease God? Do I punish myself? And if I punish myself enough, then I appease God, plus Jesus. Or do I make sure the angels are happy with me so they don't call in some chit that God owes and now all of a sudden he's like, well, I would, but I gave this guy a favor and now because I didn't appease this angel, now, you look at all these things and what Paul says, what you don't understand is it doesn't matter. What matters is the work of the Father and the Son, whose pleasure it was to qualify you and whose work it was to qualify you. The rest of this stuff doesn't matter. He says, giving thanks to the Father who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. This is a direct dig at Gnosticism, who said, hey, only those of us special ones who can hold the whole serial killer board in our head and explain it all, those of us, we're the ones that are special. We have the light. The rest of you who are like asking questions, you don't have the light. But Paul says, no, what you don't understand is that there is this light and there is this darkness, but it's not you being special and knowing more than other people, it's you being qualified by the Father, not by your own actions. He has delivered us from the domain of darkness. There's that other thing. Like you say, well, Gnosticism says, well, if you don't get it, then you're in darkness. If you do get it, in your light. And he says, no, the people that are in light are those who have trusted in Jesus, and he has brought us out of that domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. He sets up these ideas of authority, the domain of darkness versus the kingdom of his Son. And he said, you're concerned that once you get there, that it's going to be taken away from you, that you're not going to do enough, you're not going to meet the standard, you're not going to pay your dues, and it's going to be taken care of you. But what I'm telling you is that you are under authority. You are under the authority of the domain of darkness. This is my left side, left hand is evil, right? All that stuff, so we'll put it over here. We're under the domain of darkness. And that means that you can't get out from under that domain. That sin has bound you for hell and death, and you can't do anything to get out of that. If you're a citizen of this country, it's really hard for you to get out from under this country. You leave here, they're still going to want you to pay your taxes. You say, I don't want to be a part of this anymore. It's really hard to get rid of that because once you're under the authority of something, it doesn't matter what you do. You can't escape from that. But he says what the Son has done is he has raided the domain of darkness. And he has taken from the domain of darkness those that would believe in him and has transferred them to the kingdom of his authority. And there is no one and nothing that can take from him. Because he can defeat death, but the domain of darkness cannot defeat him. These people are so concerned about losing what they have. And what Paul says is, look, you are under a different authority. And once he has you, he's not letting you go. You are not subject to the kingdom of darkness. The kingdom of darkness, the rules in the kingdom of darkness are you keep these rules, and if you don't meet the standard, then you go to hell. But the kingdom of light, the standard is that you trust in Jesus or you don't. And when you've accepted the gift that's been offered, you are legally transferred from one authority to another authority, and Jesus doesn't let his go. You're not under the domain of darkness and the old way of doing things anymore. You're under the new way of doing things that's not about obedience, but about faith. You're under the king, out of the domain of darkness and transferred to the kingdom of his beloved Son. You have been moved from one place to another, and there is no going back. Why? How could you go back? Well, if I don't do good enough, if I don't believe hard enough, if I don't keep all the rules, he's going to get mad at me and kick me back. He knew you were broken when he got you. You think he's suddenly going to discover that you're broken when you get over here? He's like, hey, I didn't realize how broken you were, so I'm going to kick you back over there. No, he knew you were broken, and while we were yet sinners, he died for us in order to rescue us and change the standard of judgment. And you're no longer under this authority, but now you're under the authority of Jesus. And then we get into this verse 14. And I think verse 14 may be my favorite because he attacks all these ideas and all these things that he's concerned about. But then he says this, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. Now, for me, these are religious words, right? These are religious words for y'all because we use the words redemption and nobody really knows what it means. And then we use the word forgiveness, and we know what that means. But we get these words, and these are all religious words to us. But to the Colossians, these were not religious words. These were legal terms. Dealing with slavery, dealing with debt, and dealing with prison. Okay? These are legal terms dealing with those things. And what Paul does is he says, I want you to understand it this way. Redemption, the Greek word translated redemption is written down in my notes that I do not have currently with me. But the Greek word that's translated redemption, what that means is that you owed money and someone else stepped in and paid that money so you no longer owed it. It can be used to refer to someone who is in slavery. And slavery was different. It's not like American slavery. Excuse me, it's either captured in war and brought over, or it's you owe a bunch of money and you can't pay it back, so you're put into slavery that way. And so let's say that you borrowed a bunch of money, you couldn't pay it back, and so you become a slave. Someone else steps in from the outside and buys you out of slavery, pays off the rest of that debt, and gives you freedom. That is redemption. So what Paul is saying is that you're still thinking about your efforts here. But here's what I want you to know. You were a slave that had run up a debt, and you had no ability to pay it off. It was going to take your entire life to work that debt off. And by the time you get that debt worked off, you are dead. But what Jesus has done is he has stepped into your circumstance and said, how much is owed? And he paid that debt that you might be free from slavery and sin. That's redemption. Forgiveness is different, okay? Redemption is when an outside party steps into your circumstance and pays off the debt for you so that you can be free. Forgiveness is different. Forgiveness is whenever the one you owe the money to says, you know what? I'm letting this debt go. I'm not going to do this anymore. So that is, you owe someone money. You can't pay the money back. The way under that legal system that you pay it back is you become their slave and work the debt off. And you're working that debt off. You owe them that money. It is entirely your fault. But the owner says, you know what? I release the debt. And you gain freedom not because the debt is paid, but because the debt is no longer held against you. And so what Paul says here is you're still thinking about your efforts here, but the Father and the Son are doing things on your behalf that you have no part in. There are two parties referred to here. The Father and the Son. What the Son has done is he has gained a payment through his death that he might offer in place of yours. So he dies, though he had not sinned, so that he has a life to offer. And he goes to the Father and he says, this slave that owes you, I want to pay their debt. And the Father, who is owed the debt, rather than saying, no, I want this debt paid by them, this is how I want it to be, this is the way it's going to be, which the Father has the right to do as the one who is owed. Instead, he releases the debt. You got two parties doing two different things within the relationship. Now, why would he do it this way? Because people ask that question, like, why wouldn't he just let it go? Like, it's his rules, nobody's going to be mad, why wouldn't he just let it go? And Paul says this in Romans, and I think it explains it a little bit better, in Romans chapter 3, verse 26. He says, it was to show his righteousness at the present time so that he might be just and justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. He needed to be just because he'd make the rules. And if you are a judge, you're a king, and you make rules that everybody else has to follow, but the ones you like the most don't have to follow, you're not just. Like, we all know these things. We know about people who get off for things, like they commit a crime, they do something, and because they have money or because they have position, because they know somebody, they get off with a lighter sentence than everybody else. We know about this. We know how this works. And no one would look at that judge and say, that judge is honorable. That judge is just. That judge is one I trust. Because we know that judge is not just. He is not trustworthy. It is the judge who enforces the rules equally regardless of their relationship to him that is just. And God is just. So we can't just let it go. But he wanted to let it go. And so that he might be both the just and the justifier, the Son was sent that he might live a life we could not live, so that he owed no debt of sin and die on our behalf, so that the Father would still be just in keeping the rules and the Son would be the justifier who made it possible for us to be forgiven. When Paul talks about this, he says, y'all are all confused about these things. And here's what I want you to know. You have nothing to do with this. My kids are not responsible for paying the mortgage. My kids are not responsible for buying their own clothes. My kids are not responsible for buying their own food. I am responsible for all that. And if you look at this and you say, well, they don't have any money, so how are they going to get by? They're going to get by because I'm going to do it. I'm going to take care of this. Well, they were really good this day and they disobeyed this day. How are they going to get by? They're going to get by because I'm their father and I'm going to take care of them. And Paul says, you keep thinking this is about you. And it's not. When it was about us, we got to hell. That's how we got here. That's how we landed in this whole hell thing, is because we were driving the ship and we crashed it right into a big rock, and we can't be left in charge of things. And so it was the will of the Father that the Son would come and rescue us, qualify us, not by our own actions, but by his actions. And so when Paul says, I want you to understand which of these heresies are wrong and how they're wrong, he doesn't start by attacking them, but he starts by telling them about the work of Jesus. And for us, who are going to face heresies, or are going to face different kinds of beliefs and try to figure out what it is, and you got me, but I ain't no apostle, guys. I can't just speak, and whatever I speak is the truth no matter what. That's not me. I'll try, but I mess up sometimes. For us who are saying, what is it that we need to believe? How is it that we interpret this? Where is it that we need to land? For us, the most important thing that we can do is understand the first point is that the work of salvation is done by the Father and the Son, and we are just recipients of grace. So, if you don't know Jesus, he has made this available to you that if you believe, if you recognize your own ineptitude and your own inability to make things right with him, but believe that he can, that he's the only Son of God and that he can, and you cry out to him, he is going to rescue you right now. He's been waiting 2,000 years on the edge of his seat for the moment that he can rescue you when you say, please. But he will not force you. Some of you sit out there and say, well, you know, if I will, but I feel like I need to get things together first. I want you to imagine a slave that owes a bunch of money and they've been sold into slavery because they owe a bunch of money. And you say, I want to buy you out of slavery. I want to pay off this debt for you. And that slave says, well, I really appreciate that. I really do. You know, I'm definitely going to take you up on it. But first, I'd really like to pay some of this debt down. You know, put in some good few years of abuse and hard work and no days off until I can get to the point that I have worked this debt down enough that I feel comfortable with you forgiving that. What kind of moron would that slave be? You're not a moron, I hope. But what are you doing? Forgiveness is offered. Grace is offered. Not for you to clean the mess up, but because you can't clean the mess up. Accept what's been offered to you. Stop hanging on to your pride and accept the gift that's been offered to you. If you have received this, if you do know Jesus, but you're scared, I want you to know that this is not on you. It's on him. You are called to live better because of what he's done for you, but you don't stop being his child because you don't live better. Rest in that. Rest in that. Do better, but understand that that's not what makes you his child or what doesn't. And you can sleep at night because you know your Father loves you and has done the work to qualify you. You have not done that work. But if you do know Jesus, but you have forgotten what's been done for you, you've thought this was all about you because you've gotten to that point in your life that you keep all the rules that you think are reasonable and only break the ones that you think everybody breaks, so it's not that big of a deal. If you are that person that has gotten to that point, I want to call you back to what Paul said last week. He said, I call you to live in a manner worthy of the sacrifice that's been made for you. Understand the sacrifice that has been made for you. And strive to live a life worthy of that sacrifice. Not because if you don't, you're going to lose what you've been given, but because of what's been done to give it to you. Paul's main concern for them is they understand not every point of theology, not that they have everything down correctly, but they understand the work of Jesus that was done for them and that they receive it. And his concern for you today would be the same. If you've not accepted this gift, it's available. The only thing holding it up is you. If you've received it and you're scared that you're not going to be good enough, and if you don't try enough, hard enough, he's going to unforgive you, you're going to lose that, understand this. It's not about you. It's about him. And finally, if you've received it and you're resting in that and you're secure, but you have turned following Jesus into some lazy thing where you show up to church most of the time, and you give your money and you do your thing, but that's all that this is to you, understand that the sacrifice that's been given for you is worth so much more. And strive to live a life that is worthy of that, because if you will strive for a life that is worthy of that, he will assist you in that striving. Would you stand with me? Our Heavenly Father, I'm so grateful, Lord, and as I think about your sovereignty in this and your understanding of who would be here and when. And Lord, you know that I don't go through and pick out specific messages for specific days. We start preaching at the beginning of a book and go through the book. You know how we do that, Lord. And the fact that you have arranged this group of people to hear this message, Lord, tells me that there are people that need this today. And so, Lord, for those that are out there that are saying, I'm just going to clean my life up a little bit more, I'm just going to pay that debt down a little bit more first, I ask that they would recognize the foolishness of that and that they would give it all up to you today. For that believer who's grown far from you and is scared to talk to you and is scared of what they're going to lose, who's not done the work to maintain that closeness with you, Lord, and now thinks, you know what, maybe I've lost it. Maybe I've lost my salvation. Maybe I've lost that forgiveness. Maybe I didn't do enough to earn it. I ask that they would see that the work of maintaining that salvation is yours and not theirs. And they might be right about their sin. They might be right about how they've neglected you. They might be right about how they've not lived a life that is worthy of the sacrifice that they've given, but that you knew that before offering forgiveness and offered it anyway. And Lord, for those of us who are like me, who've accepted this and are confident, Lord, but who kind of sit back and rest and just follow you sometimes as a thing that's our job, or it's a thing that we do sometimes, but have not turned our lives over completely to you, that we might live in a life that is worthy of the sacrifice that's been given, Lord, I ask for conviction. I ask that you would make us uncomfortable with that, and that you might bring us to a place of brokenness where we recognize that and turn it over to you. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.